Welcome, everyone, this afternoon. I appreciate you joining me to talk a little bit about the role of the leader in improving engagement. There are quite a number of definitions of employee engagement. We've noticed quite a bit of focus on engagement increasing in the last 10 years or so. And we'll give you our definition of it here in a moment. But if you just think broadly about the emotional commitment that employees have toward the organization, the level of connection to the work, creating the right conditions for all. I mean, there are any one of a number of different descriptions of how we define employee engagement. Other organizations describe it as satisfaction, pride, and predicting retention. Whichever definition you use, we feel that leaders can play an absolutely essential role in maximizing, strengthening, and building engagement. And I know some definitions talk about engagement as a function of the organization or the environment and not of the leaders, and that may well be so. But the folks who probably have the biggest opportunity and most direct ability to influence engagement tend to be immediate supervisors, immediate managers. So we're going to talk about that here today. We're also going to talk about how you can use an understanding of the science behavior to help to maximize that. So please join me as we'll get into this, and I'll solicit some of your feedback as we get into this. I hope you find it practical and useful here this afternoon or this morning or wherever you're at. So just a little bit about our organization. Aubrey Daniels International, ADI, has been around for quite a number of years. We are a behavioral consulting firm, so the folks in our organization have experience and expertise in understanding human behavior from a scientific perspective, and we've been applying it in business for quite a number of decades. And whether that focuses on engagement or other opportunities like quality or safety or productivity, we always rely on understanding behavior from a scientific perspective to help to drive that. And we'll even put engagement into the context of understanding behavior scientifically. Another aspect of coming at it from this perspective is that, as you'll see on the bottom there, we're committed to using positive leadership strategies to make that happen. And that absolutely is consistent with maximizing employee engagement. And again, we'll talk about just how we do that. Just to give you a flavor of some of the kinds of organizations that we deal with, it runs the gamut. So the neat thing about being experts in behavior is that we're not industry specific, and we can focus on broad ranges of industries. These happen to be some of the organizations I've worked with over the last 10 years or so. And not all of these organizations were focused on engagement per se, but we're focused on optimizing something in their organization, whether it's culture or safety or engagement specifically. But the tactics that we talk about, what we're going to learn about today, absolutely will help to strengthen and increase engagement across the organization. And I know from previewing a list of some of the folks who are participating here that these organizations are represented on this webinar. So let me give you a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. Today, we're going to cover a number of things. One, how you can use the science of behavior to give you insight into understanding why folks do what they do. And that is at the root and at the core of much of the work that we do. And we'll talk about how we link that specifically to employee engagement. Next, I'm going to share with you some coaching best practices that correlate very strongly to generating high employee engagement. The role of leaders these days in most organizations we encounter is formally listed as providing coaching and development of direct reports. We'll talk about ways we can do that that are A, easier to do, and B, more effective in generating high engagement. I'll share with you some proven approaches for how we can create positive accountability in our organization for both engagement and also the effective coaching that drives it. I'll give you several specific tips for building engagement in your organization, whatever that happens to be, your area of responsibility. So even within the team strictly of your direct reports, we've got some proven effective practices that help to build and sustain high engagement. And finally, I'll share with you a couple of anecdotes from some transformational leaders that we've worked with over the years that have managed to generate and sustain high levels of engagement in their organization, and what it was they did to make that happen, in the hopes that you might be able to use that in your organization. So that's the plan for our time together. I will leave time at the end of the discussion for your questions, and would be glad to answer those questions, and Andrew will provide those to me and I can respond to them. So if you have questions that come up as we're talking here, please jot them down so that when we have an opportunity at the end of our time here together, you can submit those to Andrew and we'll respond to those as best we can. I would like to start off, though, by understanding a little bit more about the audience that we have here, and that is I'd like to hear from your perspective what your organizations are doing as it relates to engagement. So we're going to use the poll function here to get your feedback on the following question. I'd like for you to choose one of these options that best describes your organization's current efforts as it relates to employee engagement. And so the options that we have here are A, very involved, B, systematic, C, casual, or D, non-existent. And again, if you wouldn't mind choosing which of those four descriptors best would relate to how your organization currently is addressing employee engagement. And looking at the early responses here, looks like we have most folks that are looking at it from a casual perspective. Currently next in line would be systematic efforts to address employee engagement. Some of you are very involved in your organization, or your organization has very involved efforts to impact employee engagement. And it looks like the smallest group here doesn't have any specific efforts to address employee engagement. And as we've been looking at this, it looks like the systematic efforts have taken over the casual, but those are by and large the largest two categories that we have here is organizations that are approaching it in a very systematic way, and then others that are approaching it in a more casual way, and that's covering about 3/4 of the population. So helpful just to get a perspective of how you all are looking at and addressing employee engagement. Thank you for taking the time to give me that feedback. And Andrew, if you'll take me back to the slides. So I mentioned that we have a way of looking at employee engagement, and it's a term we've been using for a number of years that we call discretionary effort, that really parallels and mirrors employee engagement quite considerably. So if you look at the chart that we have here, and we have expected levels of performance over time, and we were to have a minimum level of performance, but basically what the science of behavior tells us is we have two ways to make that happen. Two ways to get performance to take place, not just in organizations, but even outside organizations. The first such example of how we generate performance is something we call negative reinforcement. And negative reinforcement looks like this curve. What you notice is that performance tends to hug very closely to the minimum requirements. We refer to it as have to performance, also refer to it sometimes as compliance. But what negative reinforcement is the performer is performing to avoid something they don't want. And so the most typical example that folks would give us in describing negative reinforcement would be do it or else. So a manager who uses do it or I'll find somebody who will as a way of getting things done would be a good example of negative reinforcement. And what we would typically see is that folks would meet those requirements, meet those expectations, but most often would do nothing more than what's being required just to keep the manager off their back. Another telltale sign that you'll notice on this curve is that you see the hockey stick shaped part of the curve on the front end. Another telltale sign of negative reinforcement is procrastination. So if we had an expectation that folks complete something by the end of the month, let's say, and for the first 3 weeks of the month, we see very low levels of activity. And then lo and behold, the last week of the month, there's a spike in activity, the requirement is met, and then further, you see the performance level off once again. That pattern is very typical of negative reinforcement. So there are ways of figuring out what's happening just by looking here, that we know we have kind of a negative reinforcement situation when we see performance hugging closer to the requirements and when we experience procrastination. So that's the one option. The next option for getting things to happen in your organization would be positive reinforcement. And positive reinforcement can look more like this. With positive reinforcement, the performer is performing to get something that they want as opposed to avoiding something they don't want with negative reinforcement. And the neat thing about positive reinforcement is it doesn't matter what that is. It's entirely up to the individual. So it could be recognition from a coworker. It could be praise from my manager. Or it could be something entirely internal to the performer. Any one of those things could be positive reinforcement. And what you notice in looking at the curve is the performer doesn't check up simply because a requirement's been met. They continue to perform to get whatever it is that they're after. And so again, just thinking mathematically, when you look at these symbols, R plus, positive reinforcement, something is added that the performer wants. You drop down to the red circle, R minus, think subtraction here. The performer is performing to avoid or escape something they don't want. We refer to the positive reinforcement curve as the want-to-do curve. And this is where engagement comes in, that getting people performing above and beyond what's minimally required because they want to, not because they have to, is what we've been referring to for years as discretionary effort. And I think discretionary effort is highly equivalent to employee engagement because employees are granting to the organizational level of performance that they want to, not because they have to. And so if you look at it from a behavioral perspective, we say that employee engagement very much is a function of positive reinforcement. Now, just one more clarifying point about discretionary effort and the difference between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. One thing to understand about the consequences to behavior is they are defined by the effect that they have, not by what we intend, but on what actually happens. So even though the two most common examples that folks provide of positive reinforcement in the workplace would be manager praise, attaboys, attagirls, that kind of thing, just social acknowledgement from my immediate supervisor is the number one example folks give when asked to provide one. The second most common example are incentives, some sort of financial reward for going above and beyond. And those are the two most common examples anywhere we've worked around the globe. Those things could be positive reinforcement, but they may not be. And the reason we say that is manager praise may not have the effect of strengthening someone's behavior. If I don't care for my manager, or if I don't respect them and they come and shower praise on me, that may not make me work any harder. Similarly, I might have the opportunity to work overtime and make more money than I would be normally, but I might turn down that opportunity to work overtime because that's not important to me, or something else is more important to me, perhaps going home to see one of my kids in their sports practice. So the thing to really take away from understanding about positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement is they are defined by the effect that they have, not on what we intended them to do. And while manager praise and incentives could be positive reinforcement, they may not. Things like pride, satisfaction, simply the results I'm getting function as positive reinforcement to keep me doing things the way that I'm doing them. And so keep that in mind as we talk about ways we can build engagement, and truly understanding discretionary effort and employee engagement is really a function of positive reinforcement. So that's one perspective of looking at engagement from a behavioral perspective. Here's one other thing that would be helpful for us to understand as we get into this. If I understand the science of behavior, that tells us we can understand why folks do what they do, not by getting inside their head, but simply by watching and observing. So the ABC model allows us to understand someone's behavior, which very simply is what they say and what they do, by observing and taking note of the things that happen before that behavior and the things that follow that behavior. And so the things that come before behavior and get it started are known technically as antecedents. And the things that follow behavior and make it more or less likely to happen again in the future are known as consequences. And if we observe what people say and what people do and take note of the things that happen before and after that, it can create a very solid understanding of why folks are doing what they're doing. So let me just drill down briefly on those component parts, because part of our role as leaders in magnifying engagement and building engagement is going to be probably putting greater emphasis on one side of this equation. So antecedents come before they get it started. The definition is anything that prompts us to act in a certain way. If you think about the antecedents in your organization, the things we use and do each day that are designed to get folks to do stuff, it is a wide-ranging list, whether it's training, policies and procedures, metrics, objectives, even incentive plans paint a picture of what's expected. Tools that we provide them, webinars would be an example of an antecedent. So anything that prompts us to act in a certain way is an antecedent. What's critical to understand about antecedents is they're necessary but not sufficient, meaning you got to have them. We can't put people in on a job with no training whatsoever and expect them to succeed because they're doomed to failure. What the flip side is, you could have world-class antecedents. You could have the best new hire training program in the world and put every single new hire through it, but that doesn't guarantee they're going to go out and do what we just trained them to do. In fact, we know that antecedents have short-term effects when they're not paired with consequences. And here's the important thing from a leadership perspective. Organizationally, we tend to over-rely on antecedents, the upfront stuff, compared to what happens after behavior, which are the positive or negative consequences. So let's jump over to that side of the equation now, the consequence side. Consequences are simply what happens to us during or after behavior. They can increase, they can maintain, or they can decrease behavior. And the most powerful form of consequence is positive reinforcement. Based on the previous slide, it's the only one that gets that discretionary effort. And so what we know then is we can understand behavior based on what happens before it and what happens after it. Now, to put these into perspective, the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, says that we tend to spend the bulk of our time on the upfront stuff. Planning, telling, meetings, even emails in organizations are one huge antecedent. They prompt us to do things. We probably spend a good portion of our day on the upfront piece as leaders, where the follow-up and follow-through piece, or the consequence side of the equation, is where the real impact is. So if only one thing happens as a result of you participating on this webinar, if you spend more of your time each day on the follow-up and follow-through piece, the consequence side of the equation, that's going to be a better use of your time. And one last thing I'll share with you, if performance that we need isn't happening, the next item there, the can't do, won't do determination, will help us to figure out which side of the equation we need to work on. If someone can't do what we're asking them to do, I want you to look on the antecedent side. If someone won't do what we're asking them to do, then the solution is on the consequence side. So that's the model, and that's how we look at things. From your perspective as a leader, because behavior is a function of its consequences, we need to be relentlessly focused on the follow-up and follow-through piece on the consequence side, and we'll talk about how we do that. So just to summarize here, here's some things that the science of behavior has taught us and the implications for employee engagement. First of all, we need to understand antecedents are necessary, but not sufficient for behavior change. Secondly, if there was a first law of behavior, it would be that behavior is a function of its consequences. We do what we do based on what happens to us when we do it, or what happens to us when we don't. But consequences are key for sustaining behavior. Immediate and certain consequences are the most powerful. Future and uncertain consequences have less impact on the performer. Positive consequences are both the most efficient and the most effective. And yet, the way business is designed, negative reinforcement and punishment tend to be the most common by default. They also have negative side effects. Not because we're negative people, but because the way our systems are set up. If you think about management by exception, and think about the kinds of reports that are generated in our organization, I would predict for most folks on this webinar that you probably have meetings where you're looking at reports on a regular basis or looking at reporting screens on your computer that have red cells and yellow cells and green cells on them. And most people I've talked to say that when we're in a meeting, the conversation starts with the red cells and may never come off. So we're often reacting to exceptions, deviations. That's how our business is set up. We want to make sure that we're spending time focusing on those green cells on the things that are going well. One last point, and this is really critical as it relates to leadership, is to understand that consequences influence behavior regardless of whether they're intentional or unintentional. And most people I've worked with over these last 20 plus years have very good intentions, but oftentimes have an impact that's out of line with what they intended. So here's one other thought I'll leave you with that is consistent with high engagement leaders, is understanding that organizations are perfect systems. What I mean by that is, if we see someone in our organization, on our team even, doing something that makes no sense whatsoever to us, what I want you to understand today is that it makes perfect sense to them. They're doing what they're doing because it's working for them. Or to put it into the behavioral terminology, it's being reinforced. Somehow, some way, there's a payoff for doing it the way that they're doing it. Either it's faster or it's easier, or even I'm getting away with it. But folks are doing what they're doing because it works. So if you think about your organization, if you see performance that you're not happy with, keep in mind that the performance you're experiencing today is in perfect alignment with what antecedents and consequences are in place. And so if I want to change that, then I'm going to change the environment. So let us take a moment here to solicit your feedback on, given that most of your organizations look at engagement in a fairly systematic way or more casually, I'd like to find out from this group how you quantify engagement. And so if you wouldn't mind, again, responding to the poll here again, your options are going to be, do you use third-party surveys to measure employee engagement? Do you use in-house surveys to measure employee engagement? Or C, do you rely more on anecdotal evidence, just using examples of things that are happening to give you a barometer of employee engagement? Or finally, is there no measure of employee engagement in your organization? So Andrew's going to put up the poll again once more, and would love to get your perspective on how you take a look at employee engagement in your organization. So it looks early on here like many of you use third-party surveys of employee engagement, and there's a variety of options available to you. Looks like it's pretty close for the next grouping of either doing things in-house and looking at employee engagement or not measuring it. But for most of the folks responding on this webinar, having an outside vendor take a look at employee engagement is one of the things that you use. And then the next three options actually are pretty close in line. So quite interesting. So whether you measure it in any sort of formal way or not, the things we're going to talk about next, you can utilize to increase engagement. And if you use a formal third-party survey, we have a high degree of confidence that demonstrating these leadership behaviors are going to generate higher employee engagement. So let's go there now. So in one of our clients, we have enough data in working with them over a number of years where they utilized an external third-party assessment of employee engagement. And we also looked at a tool that we use to look at leader behavior. So this is direct upward feedback from employees to their direct reports. And all this is showing is we did a regression analysis that looked at employee engagement versus some specific leadership behaviors. And this is across a snapshot of 3 different years. But what that scatter plot is telling us is that, in fact, there is a very strong positive correlation between leaders exhibiting some of the behaviors we're going to talk about next, and it's showing up positively as strong employee engagement in their organization. And so we did a correlational study between two surveys that are perception surveys, and saw incredibly strong goodness of fit measures between 2 perception surveys. And just the size of the bubble in these scatter plots is a function of the level of leadership. So the more employees reporting through a given leader, the bigger the bubble. And so not only do you see the correlation get stronger over the course of the 3 years, you also see a migration of the larger bubbles to the upper right, such that it was important in those organizations for folks to have increasing responsibility to be able to generate high levels of employee engagement. So again, just a snapshot that shows a good positive correlation, whether you measure it formally or not, that if we exhibit some of the behaviors we're talking about here, it's likely to show up in your engagement. 3 critical leader behaviors that I want you to do more. And these are consistent with what we found out through the correlational studies. First of all, I want you to critically observe your impact. As I mentioned before, most of the folks that I've encountered over the last couple of decades really do have good intentions, but sometimes we do things that end up out of line with those intentions. So it requires us to have good objective observation skills and to get beyond what I intended to do to recognize that may have nothing to do with it, but how are people influenced or impacted by what I do. And we even have a question that speaks to my manager demonstrates an awareness of the impact of his or her actions on others. And when we looked at the study, we found that was a big differentiator for high engagement leaders. Another skill I want to encourage anybody here with direct reports to do is to do more asking than telling. We encourage leaders to use questions to help performers or direct reports link their behavior to the effect that it's having. If I'm trying to get someone to do something a certain way with their customers, using questions to say, well, how do they respond? What did they say? What was their reaction? Those kinds of questions can help someone who I'm working with, someone who I'm coaching, to make the connection between what we ask them to do and the reason we ask them to do it or the impact of that behavior. We sometimes call it connecting the dots. And when we're trying to get someone to attempt a new skill, it's going to be helpful if they can see the value, see the benefit of why we're asking them to do it that way. Again, the kinds of questions that we might ask in a coaching situation: what did you notice? Or what happened when you did it that way? If you think back to the discretionary effort curve, we often say that asking is more consistent with the want to curve, and telling is more consistent with the have to curve. Recognize as leaders, there are times where we have to be directive. And so telling folks do it this way and now is necessary and appropriate at times. But in general, if we can do more asking than telling in our coaching, we're more likely to get better engagement. And then finally, one other behavior I want leaders to get better at is the practice of shaping. And what shaping is, the behavioral term, it's about reinforcing incremental improvements in performance. It's critically important when folks are learning new skills that we reinforce efforts, that we reinforce attempts, that we reinforce progress, because what the science tells us is that acceleration will happen if we increase early on. And I'll give you a better description of that here in a moment. As it relates to the coaching we do as leaders, the objective of our coaching really should be to connect the performer, and more specifically the behavior of the performer, with other sources of reinforcement. So if we're trying to get someone to do something a new way, the safe way, the right way, whatever behavior we're trying to maximize, the first and most direct thing we can do as leaders is to provide recognition. So we call it social reinforcement, acknowledgement, letting them know that we know. And if we have a relationship with that performer, with the direct report, that recognition likely is going to function as positive reinforcement. It's not guaranteed, but it's likely. That's a good place to start. Over time, we hope that behavior comes into contact with other sources of reinforcement, and we can arrange to make that happen. But another source of reinforcement could be the impact of that behavior, which, by the way, is why those questions are important to say, did you notice what happened? How did they respond? Another source of reinforcement could be the reactions of others, and this is where engaging peers can be a powerful source of reinforcement, or even how the customer responds. Ultimately, though, if folks continue to do it the way that we're asking them to do it, and it is a better way, they're going to come into contact with the fact that it's faster, easier, or better to do it this way. Now, if it's a new skill, faster and easier are going to take time, which is why we jump up to the top and start off with social reinforcement from the manager as a good starting point. Ultimately, though, the whole reason we're doing the coaching that we're doing is to get improved results. And once a performer comes into contact with better results for doing things a certain way, then we likely don't have to provide nearly as much recognition and social reinforcement. They're going to do it because it works better for them. So I mentioned shaping as a way to improve skills. This is what a typical learning curve looks like. If I'm learning a new skill, it often starts off slowly, it accelerates, and then tapers off toward the end. When you think about our role as leaders in creating high engagement, if we're teaching somebody a new skill, it is critically important early on in their experience that we reinforce the effort, the attempt, those early incremental movements. And that may be the only source of reinforcement early on in someone's experience until they come into contact with reinforcement from the activity itself. We shouldn't stop, though, once they come into contact with that natural reinforcement. We should continue to provide our reinforcement, our social recognition, if you will, to get it to happen, and they will continue to come into contact with natural reinforcers. As we move up the curve, though, they will come into contact with more natural reinforcement from that activity itself. We can continue to reinforce, and we shouldn't fade away entirely, but the vast majority of the reinforcement for doing that skill now comes, as you see, below the line from natural sources of reinforcement as opposed to above the line from externally provided, in this case, us as leaders or supervisors. So if you think about this typical way that we learn, and again, you've heard about S-shaped curves and learning curves before, the critical part of that learning curve is early on. Early on, if someone's learning a new skill, we need to be deliberate about reinforcing their early efforts and attempts and progress if we ever hope to get them up to the high-performing aspect, a high and steady rate of new behavior that we call habit strength. So your role in the learning curve is to make sure we're providing reinforcement to get them started, to help them turn the corner, knowing that when we get to turning the corner, they can experience habit strength where the behavior happens at high and steady rates and is a function of the reinforcement that comes from the activity. So here's some other things. If we say that coaching is critical for driving new habits, for getting folks started, here's some ways we found to be effective to generate accountability for coaching in organizations. Now, we call it positive accountability because most times when people talk about accountability in organizations, it has a negative connotation. When leaders say we need to hold them accountable, in my mind, I think that's code for negative reinforcement. Positive accountability is a different kind of accountability where we're focused on what's working. And what we found is if leaders need to do more effective coaching, we can make that happen more consistently through the following steps. First of all, consistent follow-up and follow-through. That's the consequent side of the equation, right? We can reinforce folks for doing the right things. I had a client use this quote years ago, and I've never let it go. She said, "What my boss finds interesting, I find fascinating." And I thought about that quote, and it's resonated with clients, again, around the world, and no matter what level of the organization they're in. But the questions my manager asked me about become more important to me. The things that we talk about first in front of other things become more important to our folks. And even kind of the emails that we send and respond to send a message. So we may say that we have this many priorities, but if the questions I ask or what I follow up on is really one of those many priorities, then that becomes a priority to our folks. What my boss finds interesting, I find fascinating. Another way of having positive accountability is to get folks to share good examples. Give me your best example of X. Give me your best example of Y. And if I'm talking about a manager reporting to me and they're expected to do coaching, tell me about your best coaching from this week. If folks can share specifically, immediately what it was they did, that's a good indication that that coaching is taking place. Now, if we're asking people to share good examples of what they're doing as a way of accountability, we need to keep that streamlined, right? So whatever it was that they're trying to accomplish, the results they were after, the behaviors they were trying to change, any sorts of barometers or leading indicators of that would be indicative of that change, customer responses, for example. Tell us what you were trying to do, and then tell us what you did. Tell us specifically what it was you did that helped. And we say speak in bullets. We want to keep these examples to be concise, precise, and specific. Not long, drawn-out stories, but actually very specific examples of, in this case, how we're doing coaching in our organization. Here's some things to keep in mind if we're using good example sharing as a mechanism for positive accountability. And the reason we say it's accountability is if you can give me a specific, detailed example of something you did this week, and I'm going to bet that most of the folks on this call have a reasonably refined meter that would tell them whether someone was blowing smoke or was actually being truthful. Someone who can give you specific, immediate, detailed responses. Here's something that's happened this week. At least you know what happened once. And so that's why we refer to this as a positive accountability approach. And if we're going to use sharing examples, here's a way that we can make sure that stays effective. Keep it short and sweet. Okay, we don't want these to be performances or long, drawn-out meetings. We do enough meetings already, and by the way, that's on the antecedent side of the equation. Share what it was you did to make the change happen, and resist the urge to drill down into operational or performer issues. That's a natural tendency. There's lots of reinforcement history of fixing things, so folks and leaders tend to want to drill down into those issues. Keep the focus on what did I do to make this happen. And lastly, if I list kind of the highlights in advance, it tends to keep these example sharing discussions streamlined, efficient, and will keep storytelling and unnecessarily detailed to a minimum. When we use these tools with our clients and use positive example sharing, we often at the end of the conversation will take a couple of minutes just to say, what did you notice? What was consistent there? How did that work? What similarities did you see? So that's one way that we use for generating positive accountability. Here's some specific tips for how I want you to build lasting engagement in your organization. First of all, and this gets down to relationships, but I'll talk to you behaviorally about how we make that happen. First of all, trust. Specific ways that we can build trust within our teams, within our organization, is to do what you say you're going to do. If you say something will be so, then do everything in your power to make it so. And by creating a pattern of keeping commitments, that increases trust in the folks in our organization. And by the way, those commitments don't have to be huge commitments. They can be small, daily task kinds of commitments. But if we demonstrate a pattern of matching what our words and our actions, what our words say and our actions do, that increases trust. As a leader, if I'm consistent, that helps to increase trust as well. That's the first thing. The next thing I want us to do, create an environment of candor. And ways we can do that, first of all, be direct, be forthright with others. Now, that also requires objectivity. We don't want to personalize feedback that we give, but just talk specifically about behavior and its impact. But if we can be direct, that will increase the likelihood that folks will be candid with us. How we react to bad news is probably one of the biggest predictors of whether or not folks will be candid with us. So don't shoot the messenger. And again, thinking more than intention, but to actual impact. If just even some of my nonverbals transmit that I'm not happy hearing this, it's going to make it less likely that people are candid with us in the future. So I want you to err on the side of protecting the fact that people are bringing us information that we need to know. Another thing I want you to do, to be cautious and careful about, is protecting confidences. If folks share information with us, then we need to protect that confidence. And this even comes to getting feedback that we may have received through surveys. Those of you that got engagement feedback on your surveys, rather than asking questions like, who can give me an example of where this happened, that could feel pretty uncomfortable to someone who gave candid feedback on something that concerned them. I would encourage you instead to say, okay, I hear this feedback and I hear what you're saying, and I don't mean to do this. So going forward, if you see me do something like this, then let me know. So make your responses forward-looking rather than backward-looking and asking for examples, and that can increase candor. The next thing I want you to do, reciprocity. and that is the give and take of relationships. So act on any feedback that you received. If you receive feedback, whether it's through an engagement survey or more informal means of getting survey, particularly from your direct reports, act on, if it's consistent, act on what they told you. By the way, people don't expect you to act on everything, but just part of what they said. Another thing you can do is to connect the dots between what you learned was important to them and actions you may be taking that are consistent with that. Here's something I learned through my recent survey, and then explain how that connects to feedback you received. All those things can help to strengthen engagement. And then lastly, what I would encourage you to do is practice what we call helpful coaching. We call it helpful coaching because most people's experience with coaching these days in organizations is not necessarily positive. I've been asking the question for a number of years, if a superior saw you in a hallway in a corporate setting and said, hey, do you have a moment? I'd like to give you some coaching. Most people have a brace themselves kind of response to that. So many of us have the experience that coaching is in response to something that went wrong. Helpful coaching, we're going to make a determination here, make a distinction here. There's two kinds of coaching, and if you're a people manager, you have to do both. One is the more formal kind of coaching that we'll refer to as evaluative, and that's where I have to review somebody, review their performance, the good and the bad, as their boss and for formal expectations in our organization. And that's more using standards, using competencies, but it tends to be a long laundry list of what they're supposed to do. If you think about coaching youth sports, or if you think about pro athletes that have a coach, their kind of coaching is designed to do the second part, which is help them get better. And that kind of coaching is different. It's not focused on everything, but rather one or two very specific things. It's designed to help the employee get better. And the impact of the employee's actions are what determines whether it's good or bad. So the customer, in many cases, or how the process responds determines whether what they did was effective, not the boss deciding. But if people experience your coaching as helpful, they don't mind to see you coming. In fact, they welcome you coming and are willing to try new and different things because you're not out to evaluate them. You're there to help them get better. So again, we found that to be very effective. The last thing I'll share with you until we turn it over to your questions is I've had the great fortune, the good opportunity to work with a couple of leaders that have been just phenomenal in generating high levels of engagement in their organization. The first has been a bank executive we worked with for a number of years, quite a number of years, in fact, 14 years, but does a commendable job in generating high engagement within each assignment that he's had. So been responsible for multiple divisions in a large organization. And in each case, coming into the organization, and by the way, they used 3 different measures of employee engagement over the course of those 14 years. But in each case, he was able to take organizations that were middle of the pack in employee engagement and drive it up to being top tier employee engagement within their own organization. And there were 3 things that he did that helped to drive that, and so I'd recommend this for you. One is he gets it. Understands the importance of discretionary effort and some of the skills that we've talked about. So there's intellectual fluency, we say. The second thing is he demonstrates it. So through his actions, he's able to demonstrate understanding employee engagement, understanding discretionary effort, and maximizing the most from others. And the third and most critical thing is he holds the other folks in his organization responsible. So anyone with leadership responsibility, responsible for actually using it themselves. The next leader is with an energy company. And while the focus wasn't specifically on engagement, it was on employee safety, there were high correlations to engagement in that organization. They actually were a top performer as it relates to employee safety, but the focus was on how do we prevent severe injuries, how do we prevent fatalities in our business that is inherently a high hazard industry. And their focus and his focus was relentlessly on intention versus impact. Are we doing some things that unintentionally are discouraging a behavior we want? And one of the things in safety is near-miss reporting is a way of getting out ahead of and being preventative about the things that are getting people hurt. But a critical employee behavior, and by the way, it's indicative of high engagement, is getting employees to be willing to speak up when they have concerns if they see something that could have caused something but didn't. And so this CEO was absolutely relentless in looking at their own near-miss reporting system and how they responded to it to make sure that there wasn't inadvertent punishment or discouragement when people were to report something that happened. He went out of his way, in fact, to positively reinforce folks who spoke up and pointed something out, because that was an opportunity to learn and therefore an opportunity to prevent something similar from happening again. And it was that relentless focus of intention versus impact and being consistent in that and looking at it systemically that allowed that organization to generate high engagement while improving their performance as it related to safety and particularly severe injuries and fatalities. So just a couple of specific leadership practices that high engagement leaders engage in. What I encourage you to do is to think about what's a slight adjustment I could make in my day-to-day based on what we talked about here this afternoon that could have an impact in my area of responsibility. And so that's going to bring us to our last poll question, and this is a fill-in-the-blank question, but I would be curious of all the things that we talked about, if anything resonated with you as something you might do, an adjustment you might make in your day-to-day that you think could have a positive impact on engagement in your area of responsibility. So here's the last webcast poll question. Just thinking about all the ground that we covered here, what of this kind of stood out, resonated for you as somewhat practical or possible for you? And what I'd love to hear is, what do you think an adjustment could be that you could apply based on what we talked about that could have a positive impact on engagement in your organization? So we'll see here. It's a little bit different than a multiple choice question here, but just curious what resonated with folks, things you might do that could have a positive impact on employee engagement in your organization. So getting more leadership involvement came in, using more positive reinforcement, candor and reciprocity, and again, those are challenging things to do, right? But building more positive reinforcement into what I do, encouraging candor, using questions, good. Doing more asking than telling, and that's something that it's good to be aware of. And as you're driving home at the end of the day, think about who did more talking in my coaching interactions. If I did most of the talking, then I probably wasn't asking enough questions. But consistency in particular is helpful, and again, that one helps to lead to higher levels of trust. So good. It's neat here to see some of the comments that you mentioned that will have an impact on that. And what I'm noticing here is that a lot of these things are on the consequence side of the equation, right? So it's not telling or reminding, but it's the follow-up and follow-through piece that connected with you and looking for the coaching and looking for reinforcing the critical behaviors that we're looking at. Recognizing the employee sooner, right? The immediacy that has that impact. And good, the 3 critical behaviors kind of has a connection for you. So again, just helpful for us to see here the kinds of things that resonated with you. I hope you found some practical utility in the things that we mentioned. And now I'm going to see from Andrew the questions that may have come in that I might be able to answer in our last bit of time here together.
Absolutely.
Andrew, if you have any of the... Yep.
Yeah, I got some. So let's start with one from Janelle. Janelle asks, is high-level engagement really, truly possible when we're talking about a revenue-driven sales organization with monthly quotas? What's your recommendation for someone in a position like that? Is there a way to sort of have your cake and eat it too?
I tell you what, I've continued to be amazed over the years that despite what the actual business is, that it's possible to create high levels of engagement and even sustain those levels of engagement, even when the work itself or the requirements that we have would seem to be, at times incompatible. So sometimes the very nature of the work can be tough. The call center doing collections, for example, chasing people down to make payments is not fun work in and of itself. It's inherently punishing, but still it's possible to generate high levels of engagement. So too with sales organizations that have challenging goals. How do we get high levels of engagement? And I tell you what, one thing, even though that's a naturally competitive environment, using the sharing good examples is one way we've seen to get people energized and excited, which is hearing from our best performers things they may use that help them to be successful that others can borrow and utilize themselves. So they're not mutually exclusive and they're not incompatible. We've seen it work in even in those environments, Janelle.
Thank you very much. Here's another one. Let's see if I can get this. So Tom has a question about their company looking to create an employee engagement toolkit for managers. Really, the ideal is to have something that has resources to drive engagement and actions that the manager population can take. Do you have any ideas, Dave, that could help Tom in terms of some of the types of resources that might be able to provide some assistance to the manager population with regard to boosting engagement?
Yep. Well, I think, what we've seen is in most environments having some mechanism to get feedback from employees. So again, if you're not using a third-party survey, another way to get feedback from employees on their perceptions and what they're experiencing. We also think it's important, even more, not just the broader engagement, but getting feedback for individual leaders on the impact that their actions might have on others. And so the surveys that I mentioned that we use, include stop, start, continue feedback. That is, what's the manager doing that's working that we want to encourage them to continue to do. But also, what should they do differently? What are things that we want to see more of with the start question, or things we want to see less of with the stop question? But I tell you what, in order for those surveys to work, there has to be a level of trust. There has to be an environment where people feel like they can be candid and not experience negative consequences as a result. But I think those things are absolutely essential to help us get better. The only way any of us can improve is through feedback. If we don't know what we could do differently, then there's no way for us to improve. So I think that would be a great starting point as far as a resource for how we can help leaders strengthen their engagement.
So another person has a quick question, just a little bit. If you wouldn't mind sort of just reiterating that 80-20 can't do versus won't do, just so that we can get some sense of clarity, because I
Sure.
feel like there was some real interest there.
Okay, absolutely. So again, and by the way, I've had folks refer to this as the skill versus will dilemma. But if the performance that we need, the behavior we're looking for, is not happening, I think it's most helpful and most efficient, actually, for us to make a determination. We have to use our judgment to do this, but is it the case that the performer truly could not do this behavior? And sometimes we refer to it as the gun to the head test. If they couldn't do it with a gun to their head, so we're suggesting that motivation is not an issue. That's a can't do issue, and so the solution to that is going to be on the antecedent side of the equation. If, on the other hand, with a gun to their head, they could do what we're asking them to do, then the solution is on the consequence side. And so the most common examples of won't do or consequence solution issues are, well, they do it that way some of the time, but the expectation is they do it every single time. Well, shoot, if they can do it some of the time, we know they're capable of doing it, period, so they ought to be able to do it consistently. And so if I could just make that can't do versus won't do distinction, again, gun to the head, is it a case of they simply can't do it, then look on the antecedent side. If it's more a case of they won't do it, then the solution is on the consequence side. And for example, putting somebody back in training, if it's a won't do problem, is not going to help, because that's an antecedent solution to a consequence problem. So I hope that helps clear that up.
Absolutely. So I'll just wrap things up with a quick note of thanks to everybody who's participated. We really thank you, and of course, David, thank you so much to you and the folks at Aubrey Daniels International for making this webcast possible. I'll remind members that if you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to put you in contact with David and other folks at Aubrey Daniels who can help you with your specific questions. And but with that, I'll again just thank everybody for their participation today, and remind everyone that we've got more webcasts available on our upcoming webcast page. So if you're interested in learning more about topics similar to this, just be on the lookout for those as they are scheduled. So with that, thanks again, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Make it a good one.